Good afternoon and welcome everybody to today's version of CMI's 75th anniversary Leading Lights interview series. I'm Ann Francke, the Chief Executive of CMI, and today I'm really delighted to be joined by Rupert McNeil. Rupert is the former Chief People Officer for Her Majesty's Government, and prior to that was HR Director from a Group HR Director at Lloyds Banking Group. So an absolute expert on all things people. Welcome, Rupert. And I should say you're also on our Board of Companions, and it's great to see you here today.
Great to be here, Anne. Hi.
Hi. So let's start off with an easy question, shall we? Thinking about the role of values, ethics, purpose in management and leadership, what do you think that role is? Do you think it's becoming more important? And if so, how should we manifest it in our everyday behaviors?
Well, I think it's always been important. Throughout human history, and while there have been humans, there have been people leading and managing, and they have always been most successful when they have been linking that to a purpose and to values that underpin that purpose. And I actually relate this to the CMI's assessment process, which I've had the fortune of going through for Chartered Manager, and I think it pulls that together very well. But the way I describe it is that every organisation has a purpose. It requires a strategy to fulfil that purpose, and then an operating model to deliver the strategy. And then there are the inputs to the strategy: people, money, technology, data. But of all of those enablers, people is the unique one, because people, individuals, are, as Immanuel Kant said, ends in themselves. And so they require a different handling than other resources, and they have to be integrated with those other resources. So that's where, and that's fundamentally about values and culture and how you get people to work together in an effective way. So that purpose, strategy, operating model, enablers all swims in a cultural context. And I think increasingly, and this is sort of a sign of human progress, I'd hope, that used to be just the individual family unit, then the organizational unit, the national unit, and now we see, and particularly prevalent at the moment, actually the global unit, as we look at issues like climate change or response to various things that are happening internationally. So I think it's absolutely fundamental to it. And one of the things I think that the CMI standards do well is capture that breadth. And in terms of what you do as an individual manager or leader, it's sort of fractal, self-similar at every level. So whether you're having a discussion in a board, or you're briefing someone on the factory floor, or more importantly, they're briefing you about what they need you to do to help them, those are all opportunities to manifest this stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. It has to be all pervading at every level, and then that's when you really see it delivering. Now, obviously, you've had a long and distinguished career, and are obviously still in the throes of an exciting career. But if you think back to the challenges that you faced when you started your managerial career, what challenges do you think people still face, and what advice would you give them from how you overcame them to help these people overcome those challenges today?
Yeah, I think that if I was sort of thinking, what has changed, and I joined the workforce properly in 1989, and I joined the Confederation of British Industry. There was still IBM golf ball typewriters and carbon paper, and computers were just being deployed. Dumb terminals were just being deployed. I may be very jealous of the guy that actually got a PC and I just had my dumb terminal. But some things don't change or don't change fast enough. I still think that people knock up against hierarchy that isn't based on capability. That to me is a perennial issue. I think we're still not good enough at working well in teams. We're better. I think possibly we're better, but I'm not sure. But I think that's something that is always a challenge. And in terms of bringing people into those teams and being inclusive. So I don't think there are necessarily all those challenges perhaps change their context, but they do still exist. And I think my advice is to what have I learned? Well, first of all, I'd say that I've learned everything in my career through moments of realized incompetence. So working out what it is that you don't know as a result of what you've done. I mean, that's just been an absolute pattern for me. Some people like
moments of realized incompetence.
Yeah,
I love that expression,
Rupert.
Rupert.
Very important. And sort of what have I learned? I think that it's actually really important to assume good intent. I think that's something I feel. That doesn't mean that you should be naive about it, because some people aren't well intentioned.
Yeah.
But assume good intent and that you can get to a constructive outcome and a win-win outcome. The prisoner's dilemma is something that every manager should understand, and to be persistent and to look at ways around things. And I think that thing which has just been reinforced for me, I sort of came across this thinking maybe about 15, 20 years ago. And I said, well, actually, most of the problems I'm encountering that seem to be interpersonal, and there's a lot of interpersonal tension, a lot of potential for conflict, are fundamentally structurally caused because people's incentives are set up the wrong way, or because the organization is set differently. And a bit like Anna Karenina, every unhappy family is different. The structural causes are often very different for that interpersonal problem, depending on the organization. I mean, I was in one large organization, great organization, very fond of it. If you really dug right down into what were the problems, they're actually about transfer pricing of capital. Fundamentally, that's what they're about. And if you knew that, you could navigate your way around the system. So I think, be alert for, and therefore work out how you can change those structural obstacles, while, as far as possible, assuming the good intent.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. So those are some, hierarchical bureaucracies, misaligned incentives, and actually the ability to learn from your own failure, or what did you call it? Recognized incompetence. Those are all things that perhaps that haven't changed too much, and you've given us some great advice. But what about new challenges that weren't around when you started that you notice now, and what's your advice as to how to deal with those?
Well, I think the one that really strikes me as a change, and I look at this with kids who are either just in or coming into the labour market in my family, is speed. Because I think that actually, if I think about when I joined the workforce, you had the luxury of a bit of time to reflect and consider. And I had one of the great things of working in professional services I did is you get some great mentors among your clients. And one of the greatest of those was a general counsel for a FTSE 50 company, a very wise man. And he said, well, I'm a lawyer and I reserve the right to take 2 days to reply to a letter. Which he meant, I'm going to think about it. I'm not going to be rushed. And I thought that was quite interesting. Now that sounds completely unacceptable today. How could I'd be very cross for lawyers taking 2 days to reply to my letters. But so the speed of business has increased. Mm-hmm. And I think that has an impact on decision making, and it's driven by expectations that are created by technology. And I think that requires a bit of thought about how one responds to that. And if you've read, Thinking Fast and Slow and Daniel Kahneman and know about hot brains and cold brains and things like that, you sort of wonder, well, actually, how do you inject more reflective time into the decision-making process, into your thinking?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We are all rushed off our feet making decisions, and sometimes you just need to take time. So are you saying that when rushed, you should push back and say, no, I need time to reflect?
I think actually I mean, great if you've got the luxury of that. I think being agile and iterative and leaving yourself room to go back and adjust what you've done, I think are really important things. I mean, we've moved from a world of waterfall projects to agile projects, and reality is somewhere in between. But knowing when you can be agile and what's immovable and when you've taken an irrevocable decision is quite important. And I guess I'd sum all that up in saying it's about making sure you've got time to reflect. And I think it was a great chairman who I work with, Win Bischoff, who I think said, well, you know, I think it was an NFT interview actually, he put it, that, you know, you things look different in the morning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great adage. And yes, indeed, Win is a great chairman. Well, we've talked a little bit about how individuals can cope with this, but looking across organizations, how do institutions find the right balance between continuity and change, in your view?
Well, I think they are both important constants. And one of my favorite books is Giuseppe de Lampedusa's book, The Leopard. And I'm probably going to get the paraphrase the quote incorrectly, but everything must change so that everything can stay the same. We're in a constant state of change. You know, things will deteriorate. Your organization will fail unless you do change. You know, we're always running to keep still, same place, and hopefully be accelerating to progress. And really, it's about exploiting the opportunities that change brings. So if I think about the last role I've been doing, the best role I've had so far, which was in the civil service, was, you know, we went through two massive periods of change, but through EU exit and then COVID, and then, you know, we've had Ukraine most recently. And I think what happened over that period was that positive institutional change. Let's take an example, recognizing that you need specialist capability to do effective things in government, something that really took root in the early parts of the 2010s, has actually been very successfully deployed. You look at digital skills, finance skills, even HR skills, those things which were science, you know, an awareness of that and being able to progress that. And, you know, we've probably been able to cram in those periods significant, you know, years of change into only a few years, and that's a positive. So exploiting the pressure for change planfully, I think that's the way organizations should do it, and how I would always recommend they should do it.
Yes, no, it's a good point, and they're both equally valid, as you say, and we need both of them. Now, I know that you attended our first CMI Women's Conference last week. Thank you so much for coming. It was a great event. As a leader, how are you making sure that as many women as men still fulfill their ambitions, and also other marginalized groups? One of the data points for our 75th anniversary is to highlight the gaps, right? We're still short over 500,000 female managers, 100,000 ethnically diverse managers, 290,000 disabled managers, over 400,000 from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So what can we do to make sure that these underrepresented groups are represented in the vital roles of management and leadership?
This is something I'm very, very passionate about. And if you believe that we want everybody to fulfill their potential, and actually, because if we don't do that, our organizations won't have the best capability within them, then you've got to be concerned about this, as well as issues of social equity and values, and because it's just the right thing to do. You know, how can it be the case that there is such low representation? It's something that we were concerned about and actually made significant progress on over the past few years in civil service. You know, let's take a particular example: woeful lack of Black British leaders at the top of organisations like the civil service. But actually, that's not the only one. You can look in the private sector, other parts of the public sector. Yeah, how can it actually be that we don't have 50% gender representation, male, female, on boards and management teams, etc.? So You want to make sure, and one of the risks, of course, is that we've got to be vertically consistent. So at every level, it needs to be reflecting the demographics. And then you need to look at the problems that cause variation from that. Is it that we're not fishing in the right pools? Is it that we're not creating, the barrier that professional women have had for many years, when the expectation is that societal expectation has been that they will pause their careers to raise a family. Why would I? That's just ridiculous. I feel particularly strongly about this. So my mother, she joined the Foreign Office in the mid 60s. She got married and had to leave because you weren't allowed to be married and working in the Foreign Office at that time. Now things have progressed, thankfully, from that, and that's a good thing. But we have our equivalent still. So in terms of barriers, that's why it was so good to see that event, see the energy in that event, see the diversity at that event, and really push it. And of course, ultimately, it's going to come down to individual appointment decisions, individual decisions about who goes on training courses, individual decisions about pay. So again, back to my point earlier about it's fractal, it's self-similar. You need to look at the level of the organization, the mass, and about what's happening at the individual level, and increasingly what's happening within teams. And I think one of the things that really pleased me with the diversity inclusion strategy, which the government produced earlier this year, a lot of work, a lot of stakeholder involvement, that is, it started to talk about team inclusion and representation, as well as what happens at the individual level and the macro level, because so much of what needs to be done can happen really well and powerfully if you think about it at the team level.
Yeah, you're right. And taking a look and making sure those teams are diverse and inclusive and represent different individual backgrounds and ways of thinking is very, very important. And yet, a couple of points. Firstly, for those managers, and many of them tell us that they still feel awkward addressing this. So, for example, addressing issues of race or disability because they make them uncomfortable. How do we make managers more comfortable discussing these issues that may come up in the workplace?
Well, I think it's I don't think it's optional, first of all. That's an important point. So, and people shouldn't be feeling that way about their customers, and they shouldn't be feeling that way about their colleagues and the people who should be their colleagues, but aren't because they're underrepresented. And I think it's actually about, well, just meeting people, having those people. Let's take an example. If your recruitment processes are so poor that you're not actually interviewing, shortlisting people from certain groups, then you won't be meeting them and seeing them through that process, and you won't be appointing them, and you'll be feeling, more homogenous and uncomfortable in your organization. So I think, again, back to point, you've got to be proactive, persistent, and actively saying, well, actually, how do I bring in some? If I don't have someone in my team who's of this group that I want represented, how can I actively go out through schools outreach or colleges and find and mentor people like that, so I can try and persuade them to join my organization or think about careers in my organization. So being inclusive, just be inclusive.
Yeah, and get out and meet people and talk to them. And if you're not talking to them, change your processes and the way you do things so you do get to meet and talk to them and change what you do. Yeah. Now, the second part of my question concerns, again, some data that we looked at the conference last week, which showed that, unfortunately, about a third of male managers, and that's 3 times as many as female managers, so 33% compared to 13%, think we've gone too far in gender equality, for example, and yet, as we know, we still have quite a big representational gap. So what do you say to those people?
Well, bluntly, there's no one I'd want to work with who had that view, and it's the view of rascals. It's a terrible view. And by the way, it's not limited to gender, is it? It's a general pushback of people who perhaps have being able to be comfortable in the status quo. It's not good for their organizations. And actually, one of the points about values and professional standards and other things is that, in fact, it's probably the defining thing about professional standards. It's also in the Nolan principles. Like you should not be self-interested. You should be interested in the ends and needs of your organization. And that view is not a view that is going to be in the interest of any organization.
Yeah, no, it's true. And one of the pieces of advice, and that's implicit in what you've just said there, is, this is a business issue, right? And it also is good not just for the organization, but for all the individuals in the organization, because it's not a zero-sum game. It's actually makes the pie bigger and better for everybody. And I think sometimes individuals forget that.
And if you're not taking decisions on the basis of, a sensible view of culture and inclusion, and on the data and on business need, and that's a manifestation of it, what other bad decisions are you taking in your business? Would be the other way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because you will be taking worse decisions if you don't have diversity. Well, looking at diversity, one of the big questions for our 75th has been, we're looking at, as I mentioned, socioeconomic background, gender, ethnicity, and disability among, as well as LGBTQ plus, and age. So a lot of different characteristics. Now, there are kind of two schools of thoughts about this. There are some people that say, actually, those characteristics are quite distinct, and therefore you should look at them in quite distinctly, because the needs of a wheelchair user and a Black Muslim woman who's able-bodied might be different. Some people say, well, no, actually, it's all about creating belonging and an inclusive culture. And so that's, really the key to unlocking this. Where are you on that spectrum, and what do you think is the best approach?
Well, I take a sort of a business view of it, which is when we look at our customers, we like to analyze them through multiple lenses and look at it in as granular a way as possible. And you can do a cut that says I'm looking at it with an ethnic cut or a socioeconomic background cut or a gender cut, but actually there are going to be groups of intersection, an important concept, intersectionality, where the needs of an older white male who is coming to the end of their career, and that's one segment, versus a new person from, say, a South Asian background who is entering the workforce for the first time with their degree. So you need to take into account those differences, and I think you've got to look at that. And I think there's some really interesting thinking that all organizations need to do about that granularity, and about, well, actually, why is this group progressing faster and making, and getting through the stages in our interview process more successfully than this group? What does it tell us about our bias in the system? And is it our interviews that are biased? Is it our algorithms that are biased in selection, and all of those things? Or is there some other root cause that's structural in society more generally that means that we need to provide some additional support? So there's a whole set of things there. So I don't see incompatibility. I think you need to be ruthlessly forensically analyzing the data, drawing the insights from it, and the more granular you can get, and appreciating the richness and complexity of that data is important. And also definitions. So definitions of, one of the things that happened over the past sort of 6 or 7 years was we got much better at understanding and defining socioeconomic background. That was a question. We didn't know how to do it. We worked with other employers to try and work out what we thought would be a good working definition. And when we dug into our graduate recruitment, we discovered that if you look at it at the level of people who come from a non-white background, it looked okay. But when you actually broke it down, there were groups in there who a few years ago were not progressing, like people from an Afro-Caribbean background. So you need to be quite forensic.
Yeah, so very much a champion of data and measurement. So collecting the data, measuring the data. Can you comment on that? Because what we know is very few organizations actually do that beyond what's legally required of them?
Well, I think in any part of business, you need data. It's one of my key, I list it in my key enablers. You've got to be doing it. You need to know how to draw insight from that data, and you need to act on it. And one of the most frustrating things, which I'm sure people on this call have encountered, is when someone says, we can't take that decision because we need more data. Really? So I think there is, using data is, it's essential for every business endeavor, every management action, but it's never a replacement. It's always an input supplement to the exercise of good judgment, which is what management and leadership are ultimately about.
You're right. And of course, you're never going to have perfect data, but you can usually have enough. And indeed, often in very senior roles, it's enough just to look around the table at who's in the room.
Yeah.
Right. And then that can give you data that it's not really diverse. So that's actually quite important. But, you've mentioned technology, you referred to algorithms. Do you see technology being the friend of accelerating inclusion and diversity? And any thoughts on what you might find particularly helpful for organizations as to how we might do that?
Well, I think definitely, and I think at several levels. I think first of all, selection is hugely improved, enabled when you've got good data and data that allows you to measure stages of the system and work out, process engineering. Basically, selection is a process. It benefits from the data that you'd use in a production line or any other form of process engineering, Six Sigma and all of those good things that we need to know about. So that's one part of it. But then technology is also a massively powerful enabler of how people work. So my hypothesis, to be proved or disproved, would be that we will find that with video conferencing, with the opportunity of platforms like this, and the way we're able to talk, Anne, in this setting, the fact that someone could actually watch this later and record, that's technology helping give people more access in their working lives. And my sense of a period, this sort of unique experiment in business history, where people have, over the past few years, been largely working virtually, is that actually it's been quite helpful for suppressing hierarchical tendencies that exist when people are in rooms together. Now, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be in rooms together. They should, but we should also bear in mind that actually the experience has been a bit different of hierarchy through the technology. So technology is very helpful in all those respects, and it will continue to be and offer more things.
Yeah, so I like to say, when we do our Zoom, we're all in the same size box, right? And that's really what you mean about the hierarchy, right? I can't really, it's not like I'm in the office and I can tell the most important guy because he's got a huge office, a whole floor to himself, right? And I'm down, on the first floor in a little cubby hole. That all goes away, and we're all in the same size box. And in that way, I think you're right. It was the great leveler. It allowed us all to experience things on a more equal footing. So I think that's a really good observation. By the way, if you have a question for Rupert, we are going to be taking some questions later on. Just put them in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. But first, so that's a transition into COVID, obviously a huge disruption for everybody. Some good things, some bad things. What did you personally learn about your leadership style in COVID? And then what do you think we've collectively learned about leadership and management more generally?
So I think I learned a lot about the power that managers, leaders have to just convene, that actually getting people together and as a team. And I think we reinforced, the great privilege I had was to be, I guess you could think of it sort of as the HR director for a sector, each of which was its own pretty large organization in some cases. So how do you can't direct, but you can convene, make sure the expertise is being shared, make sure the common issues are being picked up. So that was a hugely powerful thing. And I think, again, I'd say back to, what do leaders do? I think they do convene, and that's a skill. I think we learned a lot. I learned a lot about thinking about what the real problem was. If I think about things we learned in government, I think we learned that quite often it's never a supply problem. It's actually an articulate demand problem when we're talking about skills and capabilities. So how do you help people get better at, first of all, saying, well, actually, what type of person do you need for this, and how could you source it? And then actually, what are the activities you're doing, and could they be done differently to allow you to have access to a wider group of people? And that's why I think over time, we went from what we needed for EU exit, we learned and applied that in COVID, applied it again in things like Ukraine, and that was getting a lot better about articulating demand. But the overall thing that I've sort of come out from this whole experience with is pandemics have been on our risk registers for decades and decades. My grandmother had Spanish flu. Interesting to Google why it's called Spanish flu, which is about media propaganda during World War I. It wasn't really Spanish. But I think what we need to be ready for as businesses and as governments is, if you're a fan, as I am, of Nicholas Taleb, the black swans. How do we make sure that our organizations are resilient and able to respond to things that we can't even contemplate and aren't on our risk registers? That's a big takeaway from me. I thought, well, if this is how difficult it was to do this thing, what about things that actually I'm not going to have even 48 hours to prepare for?
Yeah. And so, speaking of resilience, which I think has emerged as an incredibly important trait, what do you do to cultivate that individually? What did you do? And then, what did you do to try and create resilience in teams and organizations in your leadership role?
Well, you need to make sure people are feeling supported and that they're feeling backed. I think that's really important. That they have the capabilities, that they should be asking when they feel they don't have them. Again, I think hierarchy is unhelpful. I mean, people like decisions to be made.
Yeah.
And that's a part of, that's one of the great places of being a manager, isn't it? That you're able to take decisions. But I think you want to do that as collaboratively as possible. So I think that's been an important part of what we've seen here in terms of supporting people, and also making sure that people understand that you're doing your work, you need recovery time. In any sort of emergency service, from the military to fire, police, hospitals, they do understand that concept of making sure people have recovery time and are able to do that. And I think that's true in any of these roles that we've been dealing with.
That's very true. But of course, we know that, for example, the NHS has had too little recovery time. They really have been extremely stretched, right? And so that concept of recovery time it probably becomes more important in little ways, in small things, right, that you can do to help recharge. And maybe you can share with us, what did you do when you felt yourself getting, needing some recovery time? How did you improve your own resilience?
Well, I've got, I guess I've got the, let's call it the advantage that in 2014, I had to take 3 months off work. I checked myself out for anxiety. Something I've been probably building for about 25 years. And I could even see the signs of it in my school reports from kindergarten. So, went through that. Actually, it was a very, it's probably a life-saving thing for me. And from that, I learned lots of things about myself physically. So, to be very wary of getting too tired, getting vulnerable to infection, getting vulnerable to, sleep deprivation, the fact that you can get into a bad negative spiral. And I think it's well summed up. It's a bit trite to say, put your own oxygen mask on first if you're a leader or a manager. You've got to make sure that you are healthy for your team. And again, in those environments I've described, what you might call, high resilience environments, because they have to be, I think that's a common feature of how leaders operate. They are able to do that, and they're trained to do that, and it's expected, and they're given opportunities to do that. So I also draw a lot of the social, whether it's family or friends or community, outside work, is also a hugely important source of strength. I think particularly in the community, and if you're fortunate, I'll have to have a family group that will do that, but it doesn't need to be that. I draw a lot of strength from and pleasure from actually being involved. I've become a trustee of Multi Academy Trust. Do I actually enjoy doing that work as a break from the other work? So volunteering is actually, as we know, and the science shows, a very positive way. And that's probably a good opportunity, and to plug mentoring as well in the CMI context. That's giving back in that way is also good. So it doesn't just mean you don't just need to put your feet up to be able to get that recharging time. You could be doing other things.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. The data shows that those who help others help themselves, right? Because, you not only do you help others, but you get the feel-good factor from helping others. So volunteering in that respect is a great thing. Okay. You've had a very big role in government. What do you think our political leaders have learned from COVID-19 about the importance of management?
Well, I think it's been a very interesting and actually quite positive experiment. So I've observed the way in which it's required the political and the official to work much more closely together. And the concept, it might not be terribly visible, but the concept of sort of the XO meetings that took place during EU exit and COVID, where there was a problem. Whatever you think about it, you might say, there is going to be a potential no deal day. So we need to be ready for that. How do you actually work back from that? And that's a business problem, actually. It's an organizational problem. It's been really interesting to me to watch ministers who've, if I'll name one who to me is a good example of this, would be someone like Michael Gove, who came into government as a journalist, has actually had a succession of ministerial portfolios which have been combining the policy and the operational. And we were very fortunate to have someone like that dealing with COVID and EU exit in that role. And I think you see roles being created at ministerial level now, which are, I think, a recognition of that need, and to be able to operate in the system in that way. And of course, through that, the fact that you need different forms of expertise at different points, whether it's digital, whether it's policy, whether it's financial, etc.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And of course, collaborating. You mentioned working more closely together, and working in teams, right?
Probably the most important thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, you touched on mentorship in the context of volunteering and in the context of CMI, and obviously that's something that we do offer to all of our members. But what about your own experience in your career with sponsorship and mentoring, both perhaps sponsorship that you've received and mentorship that you've received, and of course, the sponsoring and mentoring that you've done? Maybe you can talk us through that, your experiences.
Well, so I think I've just been extraordinarily fortunate with this. From my first manager at the CBI, who's John Cridland, who is a great person, but also was a very good line manager at the time. I remember him saying, actually, there isn't anything you can't do. I would get very anxious about my intro, and how much work I had to do. It's not really, if you had 8 hours, you could clear it, couldn't you? And I've kept that in my mind, throughout my career. If I have 8 hours, I'll be able to deal with this. It was very good. And then actually, when I went into professional services, I joined Arthur Andersen, then was in Deloitte. But during that time, and again, it is about individuals. So I'm going to name 3 individuals. I had 3 amazing women as my mentors, and they were great professionals. Nikki Denby, I'm doing the chronological order because I wouldn't want to offend them in importance. Carol Arrowsmith, and then when I joined Barclays, and great person, Kathy Turner. And those 3 people, if I to sort of pick who has been most influential on me as a manager and a leader, it would be those 3 great leaders.
Brilliant. And were they sponsors, or did they advocate for your career progression, or were they mentors coaching you on particular things, or a bit of both?
You'll probably detect a bit of a theme that I don't think things are mutually exclusive. They were all three of those things. I know that they were all active advocates, but they wouldn't have been advocates, I think, if they hadn't held me to very high standards during that time. They delivered some pretty firm messages to me. I won't say which one of them gave me the great feedback. You tried really hard, Rupert, but you weren't effective.
Wait, sorry, say that again.
You tried really hard, Rupert, but you weren't effective.
There you go. And, so this is interesting because we've been talking about this at CMI. So giving honest, specific feedback that can be constructively negative, right? But is still caring.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because it helps people to learn, and this is one of your other phrases, from their moments of realized incompetence.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what was it that you needed to do? Because this is about giving a specific example, right? Which is something that's really important for line managers. Did that person tell you what Rupert needed to do differently to be more effective?
Well, it's interesting that particular one was operating in a very complex system. And it was, if I link it to some other advice, which is there were two, back to the structural point, right? There were two parts of the system, and they were not aligned. In fact, they were actively in conflict, and I'd put myself alongside one part of the system, and the piece of advice was linked to that, and was then followed by another excellent piece of advice, which is you're too close to that part of the system.
Okay. So basically, don't align yourself, right? Be Switzerland, be neutral.
Yeah. And interestingly, it was because it's something I recognized in myself. I had a tendency to become an advocate for my clients. And I had probably taken the wrong view about who my client actually was.
Fine. Yeah. No, I understand. As somebody who also loves to advocate, sometimes I can take sides when really I shouldn't take sides. Or at least you have to listen to both sides and then try and look for commonalities rather than differences. Right. So some great advice. Okay. So your vision, big question here. What would a better, fairer society look like for you?
Well, I think that it's got to be one where we have less inequality, and look at the Gini coefficients. I was looking at what are the best Gini coefficients in the world. Interestingly, though, I checked them out this morning. I think it's Slovakia, Czech Republic, that's sort of 25. We're about 35. The United States is in the early 40s. But that's a good back to our conversation about metrics, right? It's good to have an idea about gaps to close and to benchmark. It's always good. And to think, well, really, are we less equal economically than the Czech Republic? What is it about the Czech Republic that allows that to happen? And I put that a bit crudely. I was expecting it to be Scandinavian countries. Iceland's up there, but we could be a bit more Scandinavian. And I think that's true not just of our economic situation, but also how we think about our society and our readiness for threat. I think those are well integrated societies, and I think a lot of what's happening in the UK is going in the right direction for that, or can go in the right direction for that. I don't think it's a particularly political consideration. I just think it's making sure that we're ready for those black swan events that the decades ahead will bring us.
Well, it's important that you pick up on the role of civil society, because many people say that actually a lot of this inequality is baked or hardwired into civil society. And unless and until we deal with that, which is something that people credit the Scandinavian countries with doing better, then it's going to be difficult to address, right? So that notion that everybody's included, that fathers as well as mothers look after children and do housework, take paternity leave, parental leave, and it's expected, right? And so we are working toward that, but we're still some day away. And I'm reading in today's papers that, the high earners are earning more and the low earners are earning less, right? That inequality gap, unfortunately, is not closing anytime soon. So we've still got a lot of work to do. So perhaps then, whether it's as an individual or in society, maybe before we take questions, you can share your thoughts on what can we do perhaps as individual managers to address some of these things, and maybe what would you like to see the government do now that you're no longer there?
I think individual leaders and managers and colleagues, team members should, as far as possible, be looking at the just constant professional development of the people in their zone. And how do you help, and taking a broad view of it. Maybe it's not, maybe you're in finance, but you've got somebody who actually wants to get an HR qualification. How do you help them do that? How do you give them that opportunity? How do you use your network? So being proactive in supporting individuals. It's all about progress of individuals, and making sure that you're spreading that in a broad way. So, for example, it's not good if we're not all communicating virtually. We're hybrid. You've got 4 people in other parts of the country on the phone, on the video call. It stops, and you're having that developmental coaching conversation with the one person that happens to be in the room with you, right? So you've got to be planful and think about that. And are you being fair? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, this comes down to fairness in terms of how you're developing people. From a government point of view, I think keep doing what's being done effectively, but even more effectively on adult skills development. I think it's really important, and getting people ready to be able to do adult skills development themselves effectively. And that takes you pretty quickly to apprenticeships, and making sure that, how many decades, in my first job, I was working on the skills revolution, as it was called, in 1989. At a time, actually, when CMI really began to take off, which was great. That was a good thing, but some things did not take off as they should have done. And we've got such a golden opportunity now with the apprenticeship. The apprenticeships is almost getting to a point of, let's call it escape velocity, if we can get to that point. So everyone should be asking themselves, I think, as managers, could I fit an apprentice into my system? Why wouldn't I? I get money from the government for doing it, and it'd be good, wouldn't it? And I'd be making my societal contribution to the supply of capability in the UK. So that'd be there are lots of other things I could say, but that'd be my standard.
Brilliant. Yeah. Do more apprenticeships. I think we could definitely get on board with that, especially high quality apprenticeships, right? That really give people very good skills, such as management, leadership, or digital skills, because those are the skills we need. Rupert, always insightful to hear your views. We're going to take questions now.
Great.
And our first question comes from Wayne. How can leaders drive a culture of resilience in business within a world which is so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous? That VUCA term there he's using. So, question from Wayne.
Well, it's a really great question, Wayne, that you've asked. And I think it's about thinking about how, we will not be able to ever predict everything that could possibly happen, but we can do things which extend our skills to allow us to deal with analogous things. So I think practice, exercising, regular application of good risk management techniques. And in fact, I'm amazed I didn't mention this earlier, but if I think about one skill that every manager needs, is to be able to think in a rigorous way about risk management. And being aware that, it's a great quote of Donald Rumsfeld's, that you're dealing with you've got to grip your known unknowns, because there will be unknown unknowns, and you need to leave yourself enough capacity to deal with the unknown unknowns. So probably that's my sort of short description. Great risk management that allows you to contain the risks that you can control, so that you can brace yourself to deal with the ones that you haven't even seen yet.
Yeah, that's a really good insight. Thanks for that. Question from Suzanne. It feels like we're at a crossroads in terms of working flexibly, including hybrid, remote, a 4-day week, etc. Individuals in government seem to be taking a particular view on the efficacy of this. What are your thoughts? What do you think the pros and cons are?
So there are cons, and there are lots of pros. So let me start with the pros, right? So the boat has sailed. People are not going to go back to 9 to 5 working in a single workplace. It's inefficient. I'm now chairman and partner in a business that's completely virtual. It's a luxury, right? That we can do that, but it's also highly cost effective. It means that we can allow people to work with us to keep more of the money they make. so that's definitely a pro. You get access to more people, all of those things, all the things we talked about before. There are cons. So what are the cons? The cons are it is actually not necessarily a good thing to work from home. It's actually, it's not necessarily psychologically the best place for people to work. We have a friend, my wife and I, who's a journalist. She does interviews. She has to get the interviews. And I asked her once, about 20 years ago, why do you hire an office, but couldn't you work from home? And she said, because I don't like being rejected in my home. Right. So that's a good, there's a psychological aspect to it. And then we talked a bit about young people and development. Actually, people do learn osmotically by watching people in the workplace. Mm-hmm. So, the people who, we've got a bit of a debt, a societal debt built up to our young people, whether they were in school during the pandemic, whether they were at university during the pandemic, and whether they were entering the workforce during the pandemic. And we need to catch that up. So I think hybrid is the word. And presenteeism is not a good thing.
No.
Although one of my wife's cousins, who's a lawyer in the States, made a very good observation. She said, of course, the point about school is it's teaching people the importance of FaceTime and just turning up.
Well, it is important. Yeah, you're right. It is important sometimes to turn up, and that learning osmotically, right, is also critical. And the kind of spontaneous or serendipitous collaboration is critical, right?
I think that is a thing. Serendipity is a thing that everyone should be aware of and be on the lookout for, actually. And diversity helps it.
Yeah. So you're right. But hybrid is, I think, here to stay. Certainly all of our surveys say that, where actually 93% of our managers say it's important that we continue to work in a hybrid fashion. And I think something like 84% say that it works for them, right? So it's what they would prefer.
Can I add one corollary, though, which I didn't mention about lessons earlier, and it's relevant to this, which is there are some jobs that cannot be done in a hybrid way. And
yes.
one of the positive social things that's happened, I think, is that we're more respectful now of those people that do those jobs.
It's an excellent point. Excellent point. People in those, frontline customer-facing roles. But some of the flexibility principles can apply to the, people in those roles, giving them greater say over shifts and hours, right? Absolutely. Respecting external commitments that they might have, all sorts of things that we can roll over into how we manage that work, as well as how we manage the sort of more knowledge-based work that can be done virtually. Okay, next question from Fran. What is the most innovative people engagement strategy you've seen during your career?
Great question. So I think, like I mentioned, two things. So I talked about organizational purpose and understanding strategy and understanding operating models. And I think sometimes I'd accuse myself of this as well, we underestimate how much technical information people need and can absorb. And one of the most interesting bit of engagement that I saw at an organizational scale was when I was at Aviva, and the risk organization, an insurer, knew that we needed to just improve people's understanding of risk and what that meant within that context. And they embarked on a very ambitious and I think successful program. I don't know if people watching this from Aviva who say whether this has still happened or whether they agreed, which is we're going to teach everybody about economic capital. You can't really understand insurance unless you understand about economic capital. But we're going to do it like for the people who are specialists at senior level, they're going to do this. But actually, even if you're on the front line or in a call center or doing an administrative job, here's your bite-sized thing that means this is what you need to know about economic capital, what makes our business run. So I think linking engagement to building people's individual capability is really important. And also, and the other thing, which isn't necessarily innovative but happens far less than is really required, is go and talk to people in the front line. And I remember another thing, actually, similarly at Aviva, great chairman, then John McFarlane, and we went for a meeting in one of Aviva's offices in Scotland, and we were sort of an executive committee. He was there, sat around. He said, "Have you been out onto the shop floor?" And we were like in this meeting and in our real executive mindset. And he said, "Well, what are you doing still here? Get out onto the shop floor and start talking to people." And that's always an important thing to do, I think.
It is, and also to do that in a genuine, authentic, and unfiltered way, right? Because when you're in senior management, so much of what you've fed is curated.
Absolutely.
And so there's nothing like talking to the people doing the doing to get a sense of what's really going on and hear their thoughts and ideas and how they're feeling. I think it's a great point. Okay, question here from Kai. How can we shift the mindsets of senior leaders who see diversity as a tick box exercise and really embed it as a cultural norm?
Well, I mean, in the long term, the businesses that take that approach, Kai, I think, will fail. They will just be eliminated from the market. But I think if I make a sort of a more immediate point at the individual level, which I think is really important for everybody, particularly earlier in their careers, which is about how to approach recruitment processes and actually how to approach interviews. So, when you're in an interview, it is a two-way process. It is as much whether you like the people interviewing you and as to whether they want to appoint you to the job. And if they don't, that very often might be their problem, not your problem. So I think there's and that links the point that actually over time, those organizations that take a tick box and don't take an inclusive and diverse approach to things like recruitment will fail because they will be putting off people who want to join, they should be wanting to join their organization because they'll go to the places that do. The market will operate. And then in the interim, while they're failing, we give them hope to turn around by exhorting as hard as possible.
Well, yeah, I think it's a really good point because let's go back to the business case for diversity. There is a compelling business case for diversity, and there is also a very tight labor market, right? And so more and more people are going to say, I want to work somewhere where I'm respected and included, where I can work in a hybrid manner, where I'm, where I have that diversity, where I see role models. And more people are going to say, well, actually, I don't want to work in a place that doesn't offer me that. So they'll vote with their feet, right? And then, of course, the absence of diversity might lead to poor business decisions. Groupthink is the number one cause of all the big corporate reputational implosions that have lost trillions of dollars and pounds. So I think it's a really good point. It's less, it is less about compliance and more about thriving and maybe helping people see that. Is something that we know we need to do more of. Well, Rupert, thank you so much for sharing your views. They're always incredibly articulate and insightful, and you're so well read. We always get at least 5 or 6 book recommendations whenever we have a conversation, and I'm sure everybody listening appreciates that as well. And thank you for all you do in this area, and thank you everybody for listening this morning. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, please consider getting involved with CMI and joining us if you're not a member already. And you can find out more about how to do that in the chat. Thank you, Rupert.
Thank you, Anne.